Now, for our last session of the day, I'd like to welcome our panel to discuss meeting California's ambitious, and yes, in some cases contentious, 50% clean energy goal over the next 10 to 15 years. So if everybody could come out, and then I will kind of quickly introduce them and tell you who they are. So when I introduce everybody, if you could just kind of give a little bit of a wave to the crowd so that they'll know who you are. Loretta Lynch served as president of the California Public Utilities Commission from 2000 to 2002 and was a commissioner through 2004. She's now a lawyer who consults with consumer, community, labor, and environmental groups on energy issues. Magali Delmas is a professor of management at the UCLA Institute of the Environment and the Anderson School of Management. Her research interests are primarily in areas of business strategy and corporate sustainability. George Minter is, George? Vice President of External Affairs and Environmental Strategy for SoCalGas. He leads its public affairs, environmental and energy policy, community relations, and communications efforts. Pectic Courier is a partner and co-founder of S2C Pacific. It's a California-based policy consulting firm specializing in energy, environmental, technology, and infrastructure issues. And Nancy Sutley, on my far left, is the Chief Sustainability and Economic Development Officer of the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. She oversees energy efficiency, water conservation, and electrification of the transportation network. And finally, our own Michael Hiltzik. He's moderating the panel. Michael is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and business columnist for the Los Angeles Times. Again, at the end of the panel discussion with themselves, there'll be a 15-minute or so Q&A for you to ask questions. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Larry, and thanks to all of you for staying with us as the morning turns into the afternoon, and we cap off today's Energy Summit with a straight-on look at what we might think of as the elephant in the room, which is California's goal of generating 50% of its electricity from renewable resources by the year 2030. This renewable standard of 50% is one of the most aggressive standards in the world, and it anticipates a penetration of solar and wind generation that's higher, even much higher, than is contemplated by almost any other country in the world. And to reach that goal, clearly we are going to need to do more than merely aspire to it, and more than merely build or distribute more solar and wind generation. Many experts point out that the standard will require a wholesale restructuring of the state's entire electric generating landscape, because it's not enough to add renewable generation. You have to figure out what to do with your embedded non-renewable generation, which is a lot more complicated than it sounds. And I think possibly at some point during our discussion, you're going to hear the term the duck curve, and or the infamous duck curve, as I've heard it referred to. And if you don't know what that is, maybe one or more of our panelists will explain it. And of course, California is going to have to wean its electric grid off fossil fuels without the help of nukes. So there are a lot of counterintuitive challenges to fulfilling the goals set forth by Governor Brown and by the legislature through SB 350. So in the next 45 minutes or so, I hope we'll hear a lot about not only the opportunities, but the obstacles to reaching this goal. And I'd like to start by having each of our panelists give us a very brief, say 3 to 4, maybe 5 minutes digest of what you each think are these opportunities and obstacles. And why don't we start with Nancy Sutley over there on the far left, and we will move right.
Thank you. Thanks, Michael, and thanks to all of you. So I'll tell you a little bit.
You're not on.
switch off. Thanks. Thanks, Loretta. So thanks, Michael, and thanks to all of you. So the 50% renewable goal for California and for all the utilities is, we kind of look at it in the context of really a major transformation in the way we generate and sell electricity in the city of Los Angeles. And I think LADWP for many years has really looked very much like a traditional utility, heavily reliant on fossil fuels. A lot of our generation is out of, a lot of our electric generation is out of the basin, in part to deal with some of our air pollution problems here in Los Angeles. But we really are remaking the power system, and we'll replace 70% or more of the assets over the next decade or so. And so let me tell you about where the RPS, the Renewable Portfolio Standard, this 50% goal fits in. We are divesting the utility of our coal-fired generation, and on July 1 of this year, we divested 400 megawatts of coal-fired generation. We have sold off our interest in the Navajo power plant in Arizona. We have one left, and that'll come off. Thank you. And that last big piece will come off in by 2025. So we are increasingly relying on renewable energy, and on other forms of fossil fuel and natural gas for our electricity generation. We have met all of our renewable goals to date. We're at about 25%, headed towards the 33% goal in 2020 and the 50% goal in 2030. We've set a goal to get 15% of our retail sales through energy efficiency, so basically take that off the top by 2020. And we are in the process of rebuilding our coastal power plants, 3 of them here in the basin, to stop using ocean water for cooling, and as a result of that, we'll end up with way more efficient and more responsive plants, natural gas-fired power plants that can respond to some of the fluctuations in renewable energy over time. So this is all happening very quickly in sort of utility world. These changes are happening at a very rapid pace. And the one last thing I'd say is that what I found a little remarkable about the state's discussion about SB 350 that set the 50% goal was that actually all of the big utilities in California, both the private and the public utilities, supported SB 350, including the city of Los Angeles. So I think clearly among California utilities, we believe that 50% renewable in our portfolio by 2030 is achievable.
Okay, Loretta, why don't you, give us the world as it looks like from someone who you spent the better part of a decade dealing with the utilities, and maybe that gives you a perspective on these questions.
Indeed, and I am happy to share resources with our locally owned public power company to keep the sound on. So before we get to where we're going, let's talk about where we are. Where we are since 2005, when we first upped the original renewables goal from 20 to 30%, the PUC has authorized over 8,000 megawatts of new gas-fired generation in California. Since Governor Brown took office, the PUC has authorized almost 2,500 megawatts of new gas-fired generation in Southern California alone. And the cost of just those 2,500 megawatts, over $10 billion. These are platinum-plated, 20-year golden eggs laid by the goose of the PUC. So we are awash in fossil power in California. And we could really improve our energy efficiency programs to bring our pie down, our energy resource pie down. But instead, what we've been doing is buying everything. The PUC has allowed the companies to be pigs at the trough, and the trough is our ratepayer dollar, businesses and families. It is so bad that on most days, California has over 20% more power than we need, and often it's 30%. And what happens then? We are dumping renewables. We pay for them and we don't use them, which creates a huge drag on our economy. So here we are, people are complaining about high electric prices. Absolutely, because the PUC isn't choosing wise choices. They're buying everything. That props up the industry and the developers, but it drags our whole economy down. So what do we do? Well, how do we get there? We got there for this plain and simple reason that the PUC has been corrupted. And we lack the political will in California at this moment to rein them in. But if we reined the PUC in, and if we went back to just and reasonable pricing and following the law and not gorging on fossil, this actually would be pretty easy to do. One, take off the net metering cap of 5% for distributed solar generation. Two, add subsidies for small business solar generation. People talk about the cost of solar. There's a net benefit. You don't have to build expensive long-line transmission lines. You don't have the line loss. You have in-basin reliability in 100 different ways. So I say let 1,000 distributed solar flowers bloom with some energy backup. Let's count hydro as our renewable resource, and we're actually already then past 50% in many regions of California. So what I really say is let's go to 75 by 2050.
Okay, I can feel the issues building up, and Patrick, you're up next.
Well said. I'll try to stick a little bit more to some of the numbers as well as some of the potential challenges that I see coming forward, notwithstanding the issues certainly there are within the state PUC. From the numbers themselves, the PUCs do look like they're on track, at least for the 2020 goals. I think that's an important measure as far as whether or not they can reach to the next 17% by 2030 to get to 50%. But it's going to take a lot more hard work. There's only so much you can build in California, even though across the procurement sheets it seems to me that the numbers do play out that there's a significant amount of resources. But at some point you will hit the top of the scale and not be able to build within the state as easily as we have so far. A couple other things. It was mentioned about energy efficiency. SB 350 certainly has another 50% goal in there, and that's specific to public buildings and getting 50% more efficient public buildings, residential, commercial. That is a significant increase. California is already one of the major leaders in the United States, if not the world, in energy efficiency. What that does with those sort of goals in mind helps to, again, reduce the load. Another thing is of course, distributed generation resources. Yes, it doesn't count as much as it should towards the reliability, the 50% goal. However, it does reduce the load that's going to be on the system, so it makes it much simpler to actually achieve the 50% when you have less megawatts on the actual system. Another thing, of course, is energy storage. We heard a lot about that already. Energy storage is another component that helps reduce the congestion, reduces impacts on the grid so that you can store, you can be more efficient, and you can also generate yourselves. So that's going to all relieve congestion on the grid and make it easier to meet those 50% targets. Some of the challenges. Reliability, that's going to be a number one issue. Economics is going to be another issue. So right now, reliability speaking, things are relatively running well. We've got, obviously, the LISO can is going to be an issue, and we'll see how the summer plays out. But if you're in a situation where you have 50% renewables and the other 50% is gas or hydro and gas, and we've already taken off nuclear, and you have a reliability issue, if there are blackouts or brownouts, the people will start to be suspect about the direction of where the 50% mandate is going. If it's not ultimately serving the system, serving reliability, then it's going to be a problem in people's minds. Another issue, of course, is economics. The residential retail rate of electricity has risen since 4 or 5 cents since 2008. That's not directly attributable to the RPS goals. However, that is a significant amount. California continues to have one of the highest electricity rates across the country, but for perhaps the eastern northeast states. But we don't necessarily feel that here, right? Because we have the mild climate, we have strong efficiency gains. A lot of people aren't running their air conditioning like you do in the southeast in a hot, humid summer. But if there are going to be significant rate impacts, they will be felt at some point. And so when you're talking about hitting 50%, we can all sit up here and pat ourselves on the back and say we did 50% environmental, energy, and achievement. But if you're putting 50,000 or 500,000 people below the poverty line because of it, then are we really achieving what we want to achieve? Because there has to be a human element to this, particularly from the economic component. So I'll stop there and look forward to the questions.
Okay, now George, you represent not only the utilities but the gas utilities. So you may feel like you've got a heavy load to carry, but I'm sure you're up to it. So let's hear the world from SoCal Gas's perspective.
Sure. The focus of the panel is about reaching the 50% renewable electricity requirement reflected in SB 350. It's the direction we want to go. We want to rely more and more on renewable energy. We focus on electricity. We focus on wind, and we focus on solar, and we talk about the need for energy storage. But there are a lot more renewable energy sources than just electric generating sources. There are a lot of renewable gas resources. We need to begin to think about gas supply and gas delivery in a similar way that we thought about electric supply 30, 40 years ago, when we started talking about, well, we really ought to have renewable electricity. We really ought to develop solar and wind. We really ought to displace depletable resources. Well, we can start thinking that way in gas supply as well, because there are a lot of renewable gas opportunities that can, just as we did in electricity, displace fossil resources. We can displace fossil gas. Biomethane is a tremendous opportunity, and actually the ARB is really focused now on capturing the biomethane coming from most of the sources that involve the human production and waste stream. Landfills, wastewater treatment facilities, dairies, agricultural operations. All of these are pumping biomethane into the atmosphere, and the short-lived climate pollutant plan being developed by the ARB, the Air Resources Board, is now focused on capturing that, preventing that methane from going to the atmosphere, because methane is a climate-changing gas. Well, once you capture it, what are you going to do with that? Well, you're going to put it into the pipelines, and you'll deliver it as renewable natural gas, displacing fossil gas. So we can look forward and begin to reduce the fossil component and begin to create a renewable portfolio on the gas supply side as well. And there's opportunity to get to the 15 and 20% where the state is with electricity, and to continue to move that renewable energy resource into the gas stream. And this helps us address climate change. It helps us address air quality challenges. When you look at the air quality and the climate change challenges that we have in front of us, the biggest sources are the heavy-duty sources, mostly heavy-duty transportation, but also a lot of big uses, primarily thermal uses for commerce and for industry. And the long-term view is that we'll be relying on combustion resources to drive those energy end uses for a long, long time. Doesn't it make sense for that to become increasingly renewable? We're not going to electrify a lot of end uses in the short to midterm. We're focused on transportation. We're focused on a lot of appliances at the home. But there are a lot of energy end uses that will be reliant on fuels for a long, long time. And if we can move renewable fuels to displace fossil and carbon fuels, that helps us achieve our objective. The second thing, really quickly, that I'd like to say is the 50% requirement, and what we've seen recently as we've moved up towards our goal of 33%, that's our target for 2020, is that the electric system increasingly relies on very quick delivery of natural gas. When we hit 50%, the remaining 50% is going to be hydro and natural gas. What we're seeing is quicker ramping, was mentioned by Nancy, and quicker deliverability to meet the variability of renewables. The sun shines and peaks in the middle of the day and drifts off at night. What happens then is you ramp up these peaker power plants, and new technology is being developed that ramps up really quick, but it relies on immediate deliverability of natural gas. So you really have to push natural gas to those small power plants to be able to ensure we can continue to deliver in the valleys.
Okay, thanks. Maggie, Patrick mentioned in passing that we not only face a 50% renewables generation goal, but a 50% efficiency goal, and I know that's That's in your wheelhouse, and maybe you can talk about what you've learned about incentive structures and models and obstacles as well.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so 50% is a good number. I mean, 50, we like it. It's half-half. Look at this panel. This is great. We have achieved the 50% parity here. The same number of men and women. Yay. So we have these two components in SB 350. We have the renewables and we have the energy efficiency, as was mentioned before. So what I want to emphasize is the importance of information and behavior. It's not just about technology. It's not about finding, the perfect solution. It's about people implementing them. It's about changing the way we do our daily life. And it seems to me when these numbers come up, and they are great when they're, especially 50 is like probably the best number, where does it come from? How was that established? Especially for energy efficiency, do we know really where we are? A lot has been done through modeling, and we know there are big differences in how people use the same, appliance, for example. So we have we did run some experiment at UCLA in some housing apartments, and we provided people with real-time appliance level information about their electricity usage. And what we found, which was surprising in a complex of renters, so they all had the same appliances, same fridge, same dishwasher, same HVAC, same size of the apartment, we would find these incredible differences in using the same appliances. So for example, for HVAC, the lower user would use, let's say the higher user would use 4 times more than the lower user. The same exact thing happened, even for things that you would think would not have so much variation, such as fridge. So what I'm saying is there is a big component, which is behavior. We try to explain it. Is it explained by the number of people in the house, in the number of, where the home is located, is it south-facing, this and that. And there was 50% of this variation that we could not explain by something we could see. These were just people who behaved differently with the same equipment. So, this for saying that, there's just a lot that needs to be done in terms of providing the information to figure out where's the baseline, using actually a real number of electricity usage. And that also this information is also important for us if we want to change our behavior. How are we using a lot of electricity right now? This microphone, how much electricity is it using? Do we know that? Should I stop using it and speak to you with my own voice? Because we don't know. So it's kind of, for most of us, electricity is still invisible. We don't really know how much we use. We don't really know the impact. And it was mentioned before, SB 350 is not just about renewables. It's also about reducing the environmental impact, air pollution. It's a lot about that. That's why we are doing it in big part for that reason. And we don't really know the impact of our actions on on air pollution. And we don't really know also at the individual and residential level the impact of our different appliances, which one is using more than the other. It's like you're going to the grocery store, you get a bill at the end of the month that tells you how much you've paid, but then doesn't tell you how much the eggs cost compared to the caviar, for example. And it's like, oh, it's pretty expensive for eggs, but this is about the caviar, but you didn't know the caviar was expensive. So I think we need to provide this information at the individual level. It's going to be important and it's going to be possible. We also need the information for us, and I'm, of course, preaching for my own, to my own choir, but we need the information to do the analysis to figure out where we are and how far we can go. Is this 50% achievable? Have we already done so much that it's going to be hard, or is it actually something that's easy to achieve? And it's hard to tell at this point with the information we have. I want to talk about the commercial sector. So luckily, we had a good relationship with LADWP, and we're able to kind of look at some of the energy efficiency improvement and actions that be taken at the commercial level. So using the entire data of electricity usage for 180,000 buildings, we were able to see those that adopted Energy Star, LEED, or the Los Angeles Better Building Challenge and see the impact of these practices. And we saw that, you know, from 2005 to 2012, an incredible drastic change actually when we compare two buildings that are exactly the same. One has adopted this standard, the other one doesn't. And then we see a 20 to 30% reduction in energy usage. So that's a type of study that shows that there is a potential. The only problem is that out of these 180,000 commercial buildings in Los Angeles, only 452 have adopted these standards. So that's where actually we need to also think about how to get more of these buildings to adopt. So I think there is potential, but we need to, we need to get the numbers.
Okay, well, thank all of you for setting the stage so concisely. I'm going to throw out a couple of general questions, and I would encourage you all to interact with one another because, as we all know, panel discussions work best when the moderator can take a nap. I'd like to start with this question, possibly the most counterintuitive element of reaching toward a 50% renewable standard is the question of overgeneration. And that is that sometimes you can have too much electricity being generated. And when you have interruptible sources competing with non-interruptible sources, it's the latter that tend to get priority. And in this case, the former are solar and wind. So if you have too much non-renewable energy being generated, that can be an obstacle toward reaching this portfolio. So let's talk about that. Nancy, why don't you start, since you've said that the DWP is shedding a lot of its non-renewable generating assets.
Yeah, so this question of renewable overgeneration, Loretta mentioned it as well. I think we've already seen some days this year where we've had in California more than 50% renewable on the system. So there's a lot of renewable energy out there, and sort of the concern is that, you know, the wind blows when the wind blows and the sun shines when the sun shines, and you don't have the same level of control you do necessarily with the sort of traditional sources of electricity generation where you can turn them on and turn them off, sometimes fast, sometimes slow. As more and more renewables come onto the system, this concern that especially at periods of time when the demand is low, so everybody talks about the Sunday afternoon in April or February or something when electricity demand in California is quite low, that you may have way more renewable energy being generated because the wind is blowing and the sun is shining than there is demand for this. And so this is, there's a chart that everybody has talked about that if you look at the curve, people think it looks like a duck. I don't so much, but it's become called the duck curve. And so it's sort of times during the day and times during the year when there's likely to be a lot more renewable energy being generated in California than there is demand for it. So there's going to need to be solutions to this. You know, some of it's an economic problem, some of it's a regulatory problem, some of it's a physical problem, and I think the solutions are going to come from all of those things. There'll need to be market rules. So there's now developing this what's called an energy imbalance market. So where when we have excess renewables in California, we can sell them to other utilities or to other states, and when they have excess, they can sell it to us, and that can help to potentially deal with some of the price issues that Loretta mentioned. There's going to have to be just rules of the road, and those are being developed right now. And then there's a technology component, and everybody talks about storage, energy storage, so large sets of batteries, compressed air storage, lots of technology that's being developed that isn't quite commercially available at the scale that it's likely to be needed, but there's a lot of research and effort going on to get that to the point where it becomes economic and can be deployed in large scale because, the thing about electricity and makes it different than almost every other commodity is that it's instantaneous. You can't get a busy signal on your light switch. So storage is going to be incredibly important. And then the other piece of technology is some of the things that we've been investing in, which is these quick start capabilities, where you can have the generation ready to go and be deployed very quickly. I mean, George mentioned that as well for gas. And that's going to be incredibly important too. So the sort of not so good news is we haven't sorted all that out yet. But the good news is we're trying to. So there's a lot of work going on around California to try to solve some of these problems.
But it isn't rocket science. We've had wind and solar since the first Jerry Brown administration. When I came here as a college student, went across the Altamont Pass and said, wow, what's that? Windmills. We have 40 years of historical experience about where and how much the wind blows in California. Just because it's intermittent doesn't mean it's not reliable. And it is a lie that we need to have 1-to-1 megawatt fossil backup for renewable energy. We successfully managed California's grid, the utilities did, for decades with renewable energy. All this, and let's talk about the technologies. We have some exciting technologies coming on board, but the basics, geothermal, hydro, wind, and solar have been around for 40 years. We know those products. They are not George Jetson futuristic products. Some of the energy storage may be, and I would rather spend an extra dollar on hydrogen energy storage or pump hydro storage than spend 17 extra dollars on another gas plant.
So let me jump in here. And actually, she's right. I mean, building another gas generating facility, that really isn't the answer. That's not how you cure imbalance. Ultimately, you do cure imbalance by a better match of resource and storage, or better dispatch. And that means dispatch to other areas or regions that have a differential in their daily demand curve. But most of what California is talking about with respect to the duck curve, this imbalance, middle of the day, everybody's at work, everybody's at school, nobody's at home, but solar's at capacity. So you have overgeneration. Well, you don't really have overgeneration. It's just the sun shining, and the photovoltaics are generating electricity. So that's why everybody's talking about battery storage, because it just makes sense. And we heard Solar City talk about 140,000 homes with solar backup, with storage backup. That solves our problems. Well, there are a lot of technologies that are storage technologies. I heard Loretta mention hydrogen storage. What we're seeing develop in Europe is very, very interesting, and we're starting to look at this, and actually Canada's starting to deploy this new technology. It's called power to gas. It's essentially electrolysis. You run excess renewable electricity through water. It oxidizes the water to hydrogen and oxygen. Oxygen is a commercial product. You send it to the hospitals. Hydrogen is essentially energy storage. You blend it into the pipelines, which decarbonizes the pipelines, reduces the fossil content of natural gas, backs off natural gas, replaces it with an enriched energy source. But ultimately, you can't keep blending. But there's a technology then to methanate, to take captured CO2 and through a shift reaction, it's called a Sabatier reaction, you produce methane from the hydrogen. And that's now being deployed in Germany and Spain and France and Italy and in the Netherlands and Sweden. They're building power-to-gas plants. They're locating them near a substation where they have a daily imbalance. This started actually with a lot of excess wind in the North Sea in northern Germany. And they had all this excess power that was compromising the grid. And they didn't want to turn the wind off because another story that the duck chart tells us is that the early morning is a very steep demand curve, and you want all your resources to meet that steep demand. And they wanted wind as renewable to meet it. So they wanted to keep the wind blowing and generating electricity. So they asked Sweden to take it, and Sweden said, yeah, well, you pay us, we'll take it. And the federal government said, well, it doesn't make sense to pay Sweden to take our electricity. Let's build electrolysis facilities with that money and produce hydrogen and store it. hydrogen energy storage. It's essentially a green hydrogen pathway, and the government is now focused on, well, we can't just produce hydrogen just from methane through reformation, because that puts the CO2 in the atmosphere. We need green hydrogen pathways, and electrolysis power to gas is one of those pathways. We've got 35 of these facilities in operation in Europe. Canada has just built their first. We built one at UC Irvine as an R&D project. We're taking excess solar pretty much from midday from the Irvine microgrid, and we're producing hydrogen and blending it into the natural gas system, decarbonizing the pipeline. So there's a tremendous future opportunity that expands our renewable energy resources. So when you step back and you look at renewable natural gas from biomethane, from organic sources, and then you look at the opportunity of power to gas, you can really see how the gas utility, the gas business can become increasingly renewable and help us address those really hard to electrify sectors, which are generally the thermal sectors. You know, it's funny, I run into a lot of folks that have put solar on their roof and they're still cooking with gas. You know, so there are a lot of folks who don't want to lose the efficiency of gas. And that's actually a really big deal, is energy efficiency. What we're seeing on the gas side is essentially declining demand, but on the electric side, we're seeing increasing demand. And the more you increase your demand, the harder it is to meet that 50% threshold for renewable. So efficiency becomes really, really important. And it turns out today that most of the thermal end-use appliances that use gas are more efficient than their electric counterpart. The emissions associated with generating the electricity are in excess of the emissions at the point of use. So that's important to think about.
Okay, I want to make sure that we get to some of the other major issues here, which are, I mean, everything, of course, is interconnected as the grid is. But one point I certainly, one issue I wanted to certainly explore is the economics of this transition. Patrick, once again, you talked about the economics, I think, in terms of what our residential customers going to see. But it seems to me there are much broader issues. The transition to renewables has often been talked about in terms of how expensive it's going to be and can we really afford it. So maybe some of you can talk about where the costs are, whether this is going to be an expensive transition, what impact it's going to have on the California economy in general, as well as to various stakeholders. And I think Maggie and Patrick, you're well placed to talk about that. Patrick, why don't you start?
I actually do want to go back to something that was mentioned in the last question. I do apologize.
That's all right, too.
About the energy imbalance market. About the energy imbalance market that was raised as a potential solution to the overgeneration issue. Certainly it makes a lot of sense if you can produce more here and then sell it elsewhere in other states. There are going to create some efficiencies in having that flexibility across multiple balancing authorities is going to help to reduce costs. So that gets back to some of the cost issues that you mentioned. But I do want to highlight that there are some issues, some potential concerns that just people need to be cognizant of. So another part of SB 350 was basically giving the go-ahead to the Cal ISO to develop a regional energy market, subject to approval of the state legislature. So if you combine a regional energy market, which effectively is going to be a day-ahead market, combining that with the EIM, the energy imbalance market, which creates 15-minute scheduling and 5-minute dispatch orders across the broader West, as opposed to just in California balancing authorities, you're effectively developing a regional, what we call a regional transmission organization. I've recently come from Maryland, the East Coast, and we have significant issues with RTOs, particularly the PJM interconnect, and then also in New England states, ICE in New England. There's been serious problems that we've recognized from particularly from a public power and co-op position. You've got utilities who are the primary stakeholders. They're the transmission asset owners. They tend to dominate the governance and stakeholder. You've got self-supply issues. You have price formation issues. You have uplift charge issues. And ultimately, the question is, has it benefited the customer? And there's a lot of skepticism that it really has. And now even the merchant generators, the ones who concocted sort of these schemes, they're finding that the wholesale prices aren't able to support their technologies and their plants. So it's not saying that the California and the West are not going to have a better experience, but there are significant lessons learned to be had from some of the other RTOs, and so I think it's just a cautionary tale before before the state legislature makes that decision of whether or not to go to a true day-ahead market for the Western region.
Okay, Maggie, why don't you give us the last word before we go to the audience?
So I think, the question is really about, whether electricity is going to be more expensive. Is electricity expensive? And my opinion is that electricity is still very cheap. So, if you take into account the negative externality, again, we're talking about the environmental impact of using, power plants, and just this, is really a price that we all pay in some ways, but, we don't really just pay it with, our dollars through our bill. We pay it through our health. So I just, that's my opinion. And when you ask people how much they pay, most people can answer that question. I assume this is kind of a well-educated crowd in this area. You ask people how much do you pay? Well, maybe 50, 200, I don't know. And we did a study that looked at people who were paying their electricity bills through their, kind of the automatic transfer versus those who are paying by check and controlling for a bunch of other things. Those who pay through this, electronic payment have no idea how much they pay, and they consume way more electricity than people who have to write the check. So there's something about, us knowing, us paying attention. With this experiment that we did run in this housing, 120 households followed for a year, give them information about their appliance level, electricity usage in real time. Half of them, actually a third of them, we give them information about how much they will save if they were like the most efficient in their complex. So we tell them, last week, you used X% more than your most efficient neighbor. This corresponds to X dollars that you will pay in addition to him, her. And then we had the other group that was saying, where we told them, last week you used X% more than your most efficient neighbor. This corresponds to X pounds of air pollutants, which have been known to cause childhood asthma and cancer. So guess which one was the most effective? Health? Finance? Money? No. Those who received the money message said, oh my goodness, this is so cheap. I can only save $5 if I'm like the most efficient in my complex. They realized, they thought, that's what we think. We think that it's going to be money that's going to, kind of be our motivation. You ask survey, that's what people say. In reality, they realize, oh boy, it's just a latte. It's an expensive latte at Starbucks, I guess, but that's all what it is for all the work it takes. On the other hand, those who received this message about air pollution and childhood asthma and cancer went pretty heavy on the health impact. I agree, but still, they reduced their electricity usage by 8%. So this was much more important to people to actually do something to reduce the environmental impact than to save money. So is electricity going to be too expensive? Is electricity too expensive? I would say no, not at this point.
Okay, I think Loretta has one thing she wants to say, but if you can keep it really short, and then we'll go to the audience.
I want to echo Patrick's comments, and it also proves one thing about electricity. Electricity isn't a Republican or a Democratic thing. It's an ideological thing. Where do you stand on electricity in the economy, and where do you stand on electricity in the environment? And if California wants to do the single thing that will raise its prices the most and bring in the dirtiest energy, we will join a regional RTO, because it means California then will have no more control over its own electricity market, and it will be lodged in the hands of the FERC. And Patrick very succinctly and precisely just pointed out a few of the horrible examples that other RTO regions are experiencing.